Hi, and welcome back to the Mob Mentality Show. I'm Chris Lucian, and my co-host is Austin Chadwick. And today we have Stephen Baker to talk with us about living documentation, free and open source software, remote work, rants on modern computing. And so, Stephen, maybe you can introduce yourself, and then we can kind of get into the passion after that.
Hey, thanks for that. Yeah, so I'm Stephen Baker. I these days I do coaching and agile coaching and things like that. I always end up writing my own tools for things like testing and stuff like that. So that's taken up a lot of time in the past. But yeah, I don't know. I like using computers to make life easier. And the agile methodologies kind of fit with that, and it's been a good place to hang out.
All right, very
Yeah.
cool. Well, welcome to the show, and maybe we
Thanks.
can kind of get into the first topic of living documentation.
Yeah, so living documentation is something that I started thinking about recently because um, there was a client that we were working with that had in a heavily regulated industry that needed, to follow specifications. And we a friend of mine and I turned to, how do we, what are the tools for solving these problems? And I told him a story about a startup that I worked at a lot of years ago, a fintech startup where we had a cucumber test suite, and we just wrote the cucumber scenarios as if they were documentation describing the way that a user would go through the system. And then we added some tooling. It was a Ruby on Rails app, so we added some tooling to take some screenshots and stuff. And we found that we could then just automatically generate a user manual. And I was telling my friend Perry about this, and he said, "I love this idea of living documentation. It's amazing. We should do something with it." And I said, "Well, but that's a cool. First of all, that's a cool name, and I'm using it. And second, it's kind of already done. The RSpec documentation has been done in this way for many years. The documentation for RSpec, if you go to the RSpec website, rspec.info, the documentation for it is generated from the Cucumber test suite, and it's a really amazing thing to have executable documentation that sort of verifies itself. And there's a whole bunch of interesting stuff in there. So that's one of the things I'm thinking about lately, and I'm kind of enjoying looking at things from the perspective of the user. It's helpful.
Yeah. Oh, who cares about those people? Yeah, no, those users, right? Pesky users getting in the way. Um,
Right.
and I think living documentation is something that was kind of part of my extreme programming journey when I learned about it, and I've been addicted to it ever since because I think I spent 10 years before that feeling all the pains of not having the executable part of the documentation.
Mm-hmm.
Because if it's executable, then you can know if it's out of sync, right?
Right.
which what I found in my previous kind of more waterfall or kind of scrummerfall days was that any documentation we came up with, it was a great capture of that moment, but it just became out of sync so quickly. and so
Yeah.
um and so once you make it executable and fast, oh, I've been heavily addicted to it. Yeah, and you mentioned RSpec. What is RSpec?
So RSpec is I mean, we called it a BDD framework for Ruby, that I created back in like 2004, 2005 ish. And basically what it is, it's a DSL for testing. Back then we were saying BDD a lot. I have different opinions that aren't important about, the words we call things. And I was teaching TDD back in the sort of early 2000s, and I would often get brought in by the person with the checkbook who said, "I want my people to learn this skill." And so you're teaching a class to a bunch of people who are being told to be there, and you'll always have, in every class you'll have like this one smart arse who thinks, "Hey, we can't test something that doesn't exist. So therefore the entire premise is flawed and I'm not going to listen to you anymore. And so I wanted to take the word test out of testing because people were getting hung up on it, at least in my teaching. Maybe I just attract, those kinds of unreasonable people. But I kept coming up. So I wanted to build tooling to remove the word test. And back then, Dan North was talking about behavior-driven development and started working on JBehave. And I did some work with Aslak Helisoy, who's one of the founders of the Cucumber Project. And they started sort of introducing me to these ideas. And I said, well, wait a minute, Ruby is a rich, expressive language. We ought to be able to make better tools for this. And so what came out of RSpec, and if you look at, I don't know how much Ruby or how steeped in the Ruby world you are, but somewhere on the order of like 70 to 80% of Ruby projects use RSpec, even if they have to go out of their way to use it. So the idea caught on. I used it for the first time by choice about 6 weeks ago. And I created about 15 years ago. So it was, I don't warm up to new technology that fast.
Even ones that you're responsible for.
That's right. But the cool thing that came out of RSpec wasn't, Ruby testing tools or whatever, because I work in 8 to 10 languages a day. So the cool thing that came out of it was what I'm calling the describe it pattern. When we start talking about software, instead of saying test case and test suite, and now you have to learn a whole bunch of amazing domain knowledge to be able to test. What if we just write it out like English? Here's what describe, what are we describing? Okay. And it does what? And we write these things out, and that idea is not new either, because there's no such thing as a new idea. I just, was standing in the right place with my brain open. And that idea came from one of the things that I think Chris Stevenson did years ago called Agile Docs or Test Docs. And it would run a Java test suite, and it would take your method names and turn them into sentences based on the capitalization. And it would write out a list of what the software did. And then, and at the same time, Brian Merrick was talking about example-driven development. The test suite is an example of how to use the software. And so all of these ideas sort of came together, and we got a bit of a new testing language out of it. And that's, that was pretty cool.
Nice. Yeah. And I've really enjoyed the switch. Some programming languages and frameworks make it easy to use the describe it style. But what I love about it is like you just said, you can write it in normal English, right? And that is the test name, as opposed to, because what always happened before is, and it wasn't too bad, where you would put like a really nice name in the name of the test, and then the class was almost like the describe, I guess, or something like that. But what often happened is, what I noticed is that sometimes people would try to add English to that, and then it would be like a comment above it. Now you have two things you need to keep in sync, and you have the sync problem again, right? And so, so it eliminates the duplication of what does this mean in the domain, right?
Yeah.
The implementation details to a certain degree will be in the code when you read it, but having that nice English name across the top is like, why would this matter to a user, right? Or, or how does this impact them? And it's been really good because it's way more obvious that it should be domain user-like, which helps, like, for example, when I'm in a mob with a team, to be like, okay, so this is the part where we say more that kind of thing, as opposed to, does HTTP yada, 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 technical detail, right? And so I think even though it's a small shift in some ways, it leads to big gains if teams capitalize on it. Because I've also seen people write in there. We were just talking about that in my mob, where in the describe it, they'll just put something like, oh, correctly asserts parameters for HTTP call. And it's kind of like, we're kind of missing the point of what that's supposed to be about, but
I have an interesting story about how sort of with that, I shortly after RSpec came out, we started using it on a ad delivery platform. And I've apologized a lot, but it was a very large ad delivery platform. If you run an ad blocker today, it's definitely listed in your block history. It was a very large, massive scale, and we wrote it in Ruby on Rails, and we used RSpec. I didn't choose it; somebody else on the team chose it, and we were using that. And we were, for the filtering logic, which is the complex part of an ad delivery app where it does the ad selection. They would send us an email, and we would just copy and paste the email into a Ruby file and break it up into describe and it and so on and so on. And one day, one of the salespeople, the ad salespeople, came down and was just sort of asking a question and was looking over my shoulder and saw on my screen. And she said, "Oh, if I'm looking at the filtering, that's wrong. Those aren't the right rules for the thing we were just talking about." And I said, "What are you talking about?" And she points on my screen, and she's pointing at the Ruby code in RSpec on my screen saying, "It looks to me like this calculation is wrong." Now, she had never seen code before. She was the director of the sales department. And I said, "Well, this is amazing. This is something that we need to capture. This is, hardcore interaction around the requirements of the feature. This is awesome. We need to do more of this." And so we started inviting the salespeople to read over the test suite periodically to make sure that we got it right. And they could. And that's the power of DSLs, really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's funny. This is a little bit tangential, but years ago, I was being asked for kind of like a Gantt chart of like, what have you done like recently? And so I I created a project called Gherkin to Gantt. And what it did is it took Gherkin scenarios and converted it into a Gantt chart by reading backward through the commit history to find when the scenario made it into or was first passing from when it didn't exist yet. And
I love
so you had like all these like, oh, this started working, then this started working, then this started working. So there's an open source project out there called Gherkin to Gantt that will read backward through your Gherkin scenarios. And I upgraded it I put a provider in there for Jasmine describe it blocks. So it also does like, if it's Jasmine, I don't know, probably another provider would have to be written for Ruby, but you can Gantt out all of the describe it's that are in there as well.
Oh, that's badass.
Yeah,
I like that a lot.
Funny. Yeah, it's kind of like a born out of necessity, and you're like, I don't want to deal with like, putting together a Gantt chart and a historic Gantt chart in a spreadsheet somewhere. This is much better. So,
yeah,
that's great.
Yeah, and one thing I love about the describe it and that pattern is the ability to capture that knowledge right away. Kind of that moment you were talking about where someone was looking over your shoulder, Stephen, where whenever we're, adding a feature, fixing a bug, refactoring or something, as soon as we learn something, like get it into the code, into something that's executable like that. Because if it's executable, then we know like, hey, this piece of knowledge will be delivered to someone at the moment they need it, right? Like a failing test. Yeah. Or they're about to add a feature and they're kind of looking around in the area where they're about to add it, right? Like so and I just love that kind of like automated delivery service of knowledge. Like, boom, here you go. This is something you need to know when you made this change. And I think anytime the knowledge isn't captured in the code, I get nervous because I'm just like, it's going to be gone. It's gone. It's, and unless we capture it,
going to lose it.
It's gone. Or we're capturing it in somewhere where it's painful to dig out, right? Like you're searching, whether it's through, documents, files, email, drawings, all that kind of stuff, which is all very helpful in the moment. But if it's not executable, it's a very high risk of being gone.
Yeah. Yeah. And some of these ideas, like the idea that we're capturing knowledge in one place. Right now we're onboarding some people on a project where we mob 100% of the time, and we're bringing some new folks on. And by the way, it is so easy to onboard people when you're mobbing.
Yeah.
Every person we have yet to add somebody to the team that's not committing code within a couple of hours. On the first day. It's just, it's beautiful. But when you're growing the team, you find out all of the holes in your documentation, right? What's missing from the README? What stuff is stuck in one person's brain because we're trying to, this is when the largest amount of knowledge transfer happens. And if you've got it embedded in your test suite, and if you've got it embedded in your behavior descriptions or your feature descriptions and things like that, then it's really amazing. So I really like that idea of sort of capturing, our current understanding of the system. And then, the kind of the point behind living documentation is, especially when you're in a client relationship and somebody says, hey, how do I use this new feature? Well, it's right there in the test suite. The thing that I'm working on now actually runs Cucumber in 3 different browsers and records a video and then turns it into an animated GIF. So you can stick the GIF in the output of the Gherkin. So it basically runs through all the scenarios in my Ruby on Rails app and puts videos of people doing the feature. It's kind of fun, and I think it's helpful because I don't really enjoy writing documentation, but I value good documentation. So it's kind of nice.
I know exactly what you mean. Right on. Cool. Oh, go ahead, Chris.
No, I was probably going to say the same thing you might have, which is maybe we can transition on to free and open source software and talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So how much do we need to pay per month to use RSpec? And no, I'm just kidding.
It's funny. RSpec is easily the most popular thing I've ever released, and it's licensed in a way that I don't really like. It's permissive because everything else in the Ruby community, one of the important things about sort of FOSS licensing is that you follow the community norms. Yeah. And in the Ruby community, we tend to use the MIT license for things because that's Ruby's license. And so RSpec is licensed that way. But no, I've been a free and open source software nerd for a lot of years. I think I was like 11 or 12 years old when I became a Debian developer. And I sort of grew up around that in the open source community, back when we called it the free software community before it got stolen from us by business. And we that was sort of the early community that I was involved in. And so, yeah, that's just sort of been I strive to use and contribute to the FOSS community. And we have a lot of problems that we sort of have to worry about now with, maintainer burnout and stuff like that. Although I don't agree with most of what comes out about maintainer burnout. If people are being mean to you, and you don't like it, or you want something different, change the license that's on your software.
Yeah. Well, so what would you have chosen instead of the MIT license?
For RSpec, the MIT license was the right one, okay. But because it matches the community. And that's sort of the difference between the copyleft licenses and what's called the more permissive licenses, is that the copyleft licenses require the things that they touch to also be copyleft. So what I would have done with RSpec, if there weren't community norms to follow, I would have put it under the LGPL, which is any improvements you make to RSpec that you distribute, send back, but you don't have to make your whole thing open if you don't want to. Okay. And so that would have been an appropriate one. But there's also a lot of misunderstanding about what copyleft licenses actually obligate you to do. Yeah. Which even the companies that are producing open source software under those licenses don't understand them. So
what's the biggest misconception that you think people should know about?
The main one is that copyleft, so GPL, AGPL licenses, the Apache license is sort of a copyleft, but not quite. But the main misconception is that you can't use is that commercial use is prohibited by copyleft, and commercial use is absolutely not prohibited by GPL or AGPL or any of those licenses that are considered copyleft licenses. You are absolutely welcome to use those in your commercial software. Sometimes you will also have to release the source code to your software. But these days, because we deliver everything over the internet, even that doesn't apply. And when I moved to Sweden, I worked at a graph database company. Well, it's on GitHub. I worked at Neo4j, and they had the core version was GPL3, and the enterprise edition was AGPL3. And they argued and they told customers the AGPL means that you have to make your whole system open source if you use our stuff, so you better pay us. And I was telling all the salespeople, actually, you're lying to our customers. That is not a requirement of the AGPL. That's not written anywhere in the license. It doesn't say that. It never said anything like that. And so Neo4j, I think, ended up just fully closing the database, but that's the biggest misconception. MongoDB went the other direction. MongoDB had the same license that Neo4j had, and MongoDB said, here's everything you're allowed to do with this license, and they were absolutely correct to the letter of the license. And then they realized they didn't like that, so they made a new license called the SSPL, which is not a free software license. That changes one thing that they were unhappy with, and I applaud them for doing this. They chose a license, it didn't meet their needs, they changed the license, which they were entitled to do, which was a lot better than me having fights at my former employer because they were lying to the users about what the software license was. So, but yeah, I think that's the biggest misconception is whether commercial use is allowed or not.
Yeah, I know that, the first few times I had created a repo on GitHub for, public, and they have the prompt of what license do you want to use? It's like analysis paralysis for a significant amount of time. And then until you slowly learn a lot of that stuff. But I find it interesting because also I think a little bit, so I've been looking at a lot of this because tools like Copilot and Code Whisper now have implications of licenses. But one of the interesting things is Code Whisper has a log of every license it uses whenever it generates code for you. So it'll be like, oh, MIT,
That's
MIT, awesome. GPL. And so I found that very interesting, is that even if a large language model is generating code for you to use, you have all the licenses being printed out, so you have to say where you used it from, even in that case. But
that's key.
Yeah. It's fascinating, but it's also a difficult thing, and I think a lot of people are afraid of open source software because of copyleft licenses or the misconceptions around it. So I find it very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, maybe coming at it from a more layman's perspective, in that what are some, if you're not an expert in the law of it, because anytime sometimes I'll read some of the legal documents of some of these licenses and I just end up very confused.
Yeah, that's easy.
Yeah, is there any advice you have for someone in that spot who's trying to understand the implications of what software they're using and not, but they're having trouble understanding it?
Yeah. So basically, the only question you have to ask is when you want to use a library. That's one use case. If you want to pull a library into your project, that's the most common use case.
Right.
The only question you have to ask, the only question you have to answer is, what are my obligations in return for getting this software?
Okay.
And then you can just sort of memorize the Coles notes on this. If you go to GitHub, and I do not like suggesting that GitHub made a good website for this, because I think GitHub is a terrible steward in the open source community. But I think they did they did a thing called choosealicense.com, which is heavily biased in favor of permissive licenses. Less so now than it used to be. But that gives you a good overview of what am I allowed to do, what am I not allowed to do, and what are my obligations. The general rule of thumb is the super permissive licenses like MIT, BSD, or new BSD at least. You don't have to do anything. The Apache license, you have to say, I used this software contains this other software that was provided under the Apache license, and then GPL and AGPL, it depends on your very, very specific use case. But in general, anything that you link to GPL or AGPL stuff, you have to also provide the source code to anything that you've linked to it to downstream. And that one's a little bit more complicated. The short answer to what do I do if I don't know and I don't want to go down the rabbit hole is people can call me. And I do not offer legal advice. I'm not a lawyer. I offer expert advice on these kinds of things. And I do love these questions about this stuff. I did spend a couple of years as the open source license compliance officer for a large mobile company that you've heard of, that I don't really like to talk about anymore. But so that was my job. I would go through projects. Internal project would send me a Git repo, and they would say, "Hey, we need to know which licenses we're using and if there are any problems." And if it's a JavaScript project where they just suck in dependencies like they're falling from the sky, you can very easily have thousands of things that you have to go through and read the dependency, the licenses on. And that's the thing that's most scary about this, is in copyright in many countries, the default is all rights reserved.
Yeah.
And you'll notice the template in Xcode, if you use Xcode, when you create a new file, it says copyright, whatever your name is, all rights reserved. A lot of people put a license on their software, but upload it to GitHub where every file says all rights reserved. That makes the licensing situation very ambiguous. Because am I allowed to use this file, or does it fall under the project license? How do I know that it falls under the project license? And then some licenses are file-based and some licenses are project-based. Apache is a file-based license. So you can have a project that's mostly Apache license, but has some other things that are other licenses very, very commonly. And things like that. So there's a whole bunch of analysis that can be done. The automated tooling for it, amusingly, the automated tooling for this is that's in use in the industry is proprietary software that's very expensive from enterprise vendors. The open source tooling for figuring out your compliance with open source licenses is very you really do have to wire it together yourself. But yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, that does help a lot. That does help a lot because, I guess phoning a friend or phoning Steven and then having it broken down into here's your actions if you use this software. That's very helpful to me, because anytime I open up the fine print, usually leads to a lot of confusion because I just don't understand what's being said. So that's very good. Cool.
They do take some time. Yeah, they do take some time in rereading and stuff like that. At various points in my life, I could recite most of the GNU licenses from memory, because, but you know, those things moved out and other things moved in. But I used to have to do this all the time. I used to have to be able to look at a software project and say, we have to be careful of Section 6 of the GPL. Pretty sure, or Section 6 of the AGPL is the network linking clause, which is the interesting one. The one that makes people think that if you use a database that you have to then release all of your source code. That's the weird, it's the network use clause. So if you interact with a piece of software over network, that means that the license applies, even though you've spoken to it over a network. The difference in the case of most databases is what is the license of the driver? The thing you use, because your application is linking to the driver is linking to the server. So there's added complexity here as well. Yeah. It's
And
wild.
yeah, so I think people in the open source community in general, I think a lot less can go wrong unless you're copying unlicensed code, right, into a licensed project. That can go
Yes.
very wrong.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think a reason that those tools are enterprise licensed and are very, very expensive is because the people that really care about it are the ones that are trying to protect their patents or their copyright terms and
Yeah.
on their own software. But yeah, very interesting. I think this has been revitalized as a popular topic because of large language models like GPT and Llama and all the others, because now you're ingesting, when you generate code off of those things, you're ingesting licenses, and you have even less idea of where they came from than the node package manager.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so
Now the
that's
node
really
package
scary.
manager is getting better. As much as I hate to say nice things about JavaScript, or
Yeah.
especially the JavaScript ecosystem, because it is a garbage fire. The node package management stuff is a lot better. When you generate a new package, it has a license line. And you can, there are some tools. There's there's an NPM package called license checker, which will go through your JavaScript project. And, those kinds of things are good as sort of like a bare bones check. But if you're building your livelihood around something, you probably ought to figure out what your obligations are to the community.
Yeah.
There are a few interesting recent ones. The JSON library, there's a JSON parsing library that recently had to get rewritten by in the next version of Android. All the JSON parsing has been rewritten from scratch because the license of the previous JSON parser was the Apache license with one line added: "This software shall be used for good, not evil." And the Apache Software Foundation said at one point something like, "That's clearly a joke. We're going to ignore it and call this an Apache compatible license." And then recently they changed their mind and said, "Actually, this is ambiguous, so we're going to say it's not Apache compatible anymore," which meant that the Android team had to replace the JSON parsing library with a new one that was clean room implemented without any of the code from the previous one. So yeah, it can get
very
expensive
very quickly.
Yeah.
Wow.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, you brought up something earlier that might help transition to the next topic a little bit, which is you were talking about open source burnout. Do you mind going into that a little bit? And maybe there's a tie into remote work as well there.
Oh, absolutely. It's so one of the things that keeps coming up from maintainers of very popular packages is that they're sort of, upset that, millions or millions of people are using this thing, and they're sending me bug reports, and they're being mean to me on GitHub and whatever. And I'm not making any money from this. And this is one of the, common complaints. And it's absolutely, an easy source of burnout if you are, working to make something, and the requirements just outpace your ability to keep up with it. And if you're not getting paid for that, then it's taking from your personal life, because presumably you have other work that you're doing to survive. And it's really easy to get caught in that trap. And so when I think that, when choosing a license, you have to say, okay, what ways am I okay with people using this and not giving me anything back? And if you release something under the MIT license, and yes, you totally can get rich by making, something permissively licensed that's very popular. I never made any money directly off of RSpec, but I definitely built the last, 20 years of my, 15 years of my career, around, largely from companies who used it and wanted help. So, I mean, I definitely didn't get rich from it, but it helped my career. So I don't, and I was only involved in RSpec in the early days. When I started getting burnt out on it, I got burnt out on it because I said, I have no idea why anybody likes this thing. And I don't understand why people can't just learn that test isn't a bad word. And so I just gave it to the most prolific contributor to date, David Schlemsky. And I said, here, you run with it. Cause I don't know what features need to come next. Cause I was done. I was done before we released it. So it's definitely something but you have to be able to walk away from those things, and you have to be, okay with the ups and downs of both sides. I spent RSpec was released in 2005-ish, 2006. I spent the first 5 years or so after I released it not even admitting that I did, because it was, it just wasn't. I've written about this on my blog. If people care, it's at stephenrbaker.com. I've written the whole story of that and how the complicated feelings I had around the burnout on it. But if I had no need to earn money, I would absolutely, my dream job would be to build open systems and work on free software systems. And for me, it's largely these days about like a right to repair thing. My political view is that when you buy a car, they should also give you a USB stick with all of the source code for every piece of software that's on that car. And as well, all of the tools you need to build that software so that you can repair your own friggin' car. Especially now we have all of these new electric car companies coming out, building these computers into their cars. They're not going to be around for long. There's a whole bunch of new electric car companies out there. What happens when that company disappears? You know what happens? The same thing that happened when Apple killed the Newton message pad and you couldn't buy hardware, you couldn't buy software for it anymore, and you couldn't write your own new software easily because the transition away from classic Mac OS and stuff. The Newton message pad happens, except it's got 4 wheels and it takes up your whole driveway. And that's the situation that I'm, I think that people should should have ownership of the things that they rely on. And free software is really the only way that we can give people ownership of the hardware that they're buying.
Yeah, I just felt a lot better about myself because in a ridiculous way, because I'm not very handy and I'm terrible at car mechanics, but maybe the wave of the future is that the software developers are the best car mechanics. So I'll become like, the neighborhood hero for fixing cars, so
Right.
just, did you get the code when they brought the car? Okay, great, bring it over and then I can fix your car for you. Yeah. And so
plug this into the dashboard.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah.
Let's dive in a little bit into remote work a little more before we close the
Sure.
So I mean, remote work is super important to me because I like to live in places that nobody else likes to live.
Yeah.
So right now I'm talking to you from my house in the woods in Sweden. If I wanted to buy a bottle of whiskey, it would take me an hour and a half to get to the liquor store.
Very remote work.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And,
extra.
But because I live in Sweden, gigabit fiber, and I think it costs like $30 a month. Gigabit synchronous, with an ISP that doesn't cooperate with the police. So it's fantastic. And by the way, since we're friends now, we bought, the houses are so cheap over here. We bought a guest house in the next village. It's got a couple of bedrooms. You guys are welcome over here. You can make it a working vacation. The internet's super fast. Anybody who's watching this, drop me an email. You can come hang out in Sweden at another house. I don't even like hanging out with myself. So if you don't like hanging out with me, it's cool. The house is 15 minutes down the road.
Yeah.
So yeah. And so because of that, I love remote work. I come from Nova Scotia, Canada. And it's, Nova Scotia has a long history of high unemployment and, it's tough to live there. And tech jobs didn't come there as fast as they came to other places, but because of some of my early work in government in the 2000 to 2002, we got a lot of high-speed internet in. So people were able to get tech jobs in Nova Scotia. And then, later on I wanted to live in Cape Breton, which is an island off of Nova Scotia. And, when you work remotely, you can live anywhere. And I don't want to live in a city. I I want to live, in the woods, far out of the way, where I can do my own stuff, and remote work is what enables that. So the pandemic came along. Well, for the rest of you, Sweden pretended it didn't exist. Everyone starts remote working, and I'm like, all right, I've been doing this for 20 years.
Yeah.
Now
the go-to.
Oh, absolutely. It was fantastic. All it meant for me was suddenly jobs that were out of reach before I could now do if I wanted to. So it's really fantastic. Remote work has just been great for that. And I always say, American like workplaces, can be hugely politically driven, and the HR departments are, just always, looking for excuses to justify their existence. And so, if you go to work, you can see people on video chat, you can hear them on the video chat. You can't touch them because HR, you can't smell them, and you probably don't want to smell your colleagues. And so, what are the other senses, right? We've already got all of the main senses covered that you want to do in a workplace anyways. So why not just work from home? And everyone gets their own environment. I get to use whatever keyboard I want. It's fantastic. If you live in Sweden, the internet never goes down and it's super fast. So it's always somebody else's problem when somebody has a bad connection, and I just sit here and twiddle my thumbs and know it's not my problem. And it's just fantastic. It's so great to be able to live wherever you want, and work. It's just great. I love it.
Yeah. And that's cool that there are people like you pioneering it before I came into it because of the pandemic. And it was such a huge win for me and my family, because it's almost like a return to the family lifestyle before people had to commute to work and factory and all that kind of stuff, where you kind of were with your family. And so that's just been such a huge win for family. And I mean, even what's happening right here, where you're in Sweden, we're on the West Coast and in the States, and we're talking in real time, and the ability to do that and then go back to my mob here in 5 minutes, where they're in different locations, and to have that combination and that fantastic conversation all happen without commuting in between each of those events is super cool. So I'm a big fan as well. Yeah.
It's absolutely fantastic. I mean, I also take I take guitar lessons from an Emmy award-winning bluegrass folk musician who's in Tallahassee, Florida, and we do that because if we can do it remotely. And so I can take guitar lessons online. There are no guitar teachers out an hour and a half into the woods in Sweden. So
maybe next to the liquor store that's an hour away.
And I can get like a world famous guitar teacher, beamed into my house, anytime. It's fantastic. And I'm really glad that the rest of the world is starting to catch up to remote working, because it's great. And with the money you save from commuting and stuff, then you can just hop on a plane and go meet people in whatever time zone they happen to be in, or in every location. So it's great.
Nice.
Yeah.
Right on. Well, we are about to hit our time box. But before we do, is there anything you'd like to share or plug before we close?
Yeah, so people can find me on my website, stephenrbaker.com. You can find, my contact info there. I'm SR Baker on Twitter and SR Baker on fostodon.org, Mastodon server. So and I'm always happy to hear from other nerds about what they're talking about, and I really like just helping people with what they're working on. And we can do that remotely now. So yeah.
Fantastic. Well, thanks, Stephen, so much for being on the show. It was a good time.
Thank you.
You loved hearing your passion, your thoughts on living documentation, free and open source software, remote work. So to our audience, please like and subscribe. Please share with someone else to kind of spread the passion for these things. I myself personally have seen the joys of many of these things. And so it's always good to turn up the good and share it. So please do so. We love hearing your feedback on YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitter, and more. So please send it in. What are your thoughts on these topics? We'd love to hear it. But until next time, have a good one and mob on, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.